Hello, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, and welcome to our session. So, this is going to be the second session on our series Psychologization of Religion, where we will be looking at an intellectual history of the last century and the influence of certain major figures on the understanding of religion from the point of view of psychology. So, with that, I hand over to our good friend Luqman. I'll share the slides.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to all the people who are here for the second lecture of the series on psychologization of religion. So last week we broadly looked at how the inquiry into various aspects of religion began through fields that were emerging, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and eventually also psychology. So there were some very key figures early on in the history of psychology who began to develop grand narratives about human nature and how that determines normative and abnormal human behavior, and applying that to various aspects of human expression and culture and politics and philosophy and even religion. And among them, I identified Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and in a slightly different approach, William James. So over the course of this course, so we would look at these three thinkers in turn and see how they applied their understanding of the human psyche, of human nature, within developing a theory and then applying that to the study of religion. So first among those, we will be looking at Sigmund Freud and his psychology of religion. His approach to understanding religion is heavily built on the theory he developed through his clinical practice and his introspection over many, many decades. And then he applied that to understanding religion towards the end of his life. And before we can even begin to unpack his psychology of religion, it will be essential to actually understand his psychology, since those are the terms that he will be using and the themes and the theories that we'll be using to apply to understand various aspects of religious belief and religious experience. So I thought what we could do is that, again, I don't know if my camera or my photograph is video is obscuring the background. The aim of today's lecture essentially will be a summarized biography of Sigmund Freud, his life and his times, and how the ideas emerged from his clinical experience, his life events, and how they emerged over time, how they changed over time as well, and what the reception of that was like over the decades in which he developed his science, which he called psychoanalysis. And then we'll have a much more focused session on the theory itself. So I've divided today's lecture into two parts. The first half will be a general introduction and about his life, and the second half will be zooming in into his theory itself. And today's lecture as a whole then will provide the groundwork in which we can actually talk about his psychology of religion in the next lecture in 2 weeks. And then in the next lecture, we will unpack how he applied his theory and then talk about critiques of his method, his findings, his approach, and then specifically a critique to his understanding of religion as well and what work has been done since. And anytime talking about Freud, it's always worthwhile pointing out a disclaimer in the beginning. His ideas were very controversial in his time. They're still controversial. They shock people who first encounter them because, spoiler alert, his model of the human psyche is almost entirely predicated on the sex drive. And so there'll be a lot of discussion around how he viewed sexuality, when does it develop, what desires result in the development of personality, and what desires result in normative and what he regarded as abnormal behavior, and how those could be resolved. So I've been studying this, the theory and various aspects of it for over a decade. So perhaps my internal senses no longer there, and I'm not as sensitive to talking about it, but just, you know, it can, it's basically, psychoanalysis is not something you talk about in polite company, let's just say that, but I will be going into the detail of various aspects of this theory, because that will be applied into his understanding of religion next week. So that's just a disclaimer off the top. So, as I mentioned last week, perhaps after Darwin and Karl Marx, you couldn't think of another thinker who has influenced science, the social sciences, culture, and just the human understanding of where they are as individuals and within civilization as much as Sigmund Freud has. I mean, his impact is immeasurable in that regard. I mean, he obviously completely renovated the field of psychology, and even those who were responding and refuting him were even still themselves talking in psychoanalytic terms. And psychotherapy, since in the manner it has developed, has essentially developed as a talking therapy, which Freud developed, and how many of his terminology has entered common parlance. So we often talk about, you know, repression or projection, or as we go through the theory, I'm sure there'll be some, you'll recognize many of the words already and how they've actually just entered common language. And that's where a quote comes in from Muhammad Masud Raza Khan, who was a Pakistani British psychoanalyst who traveled to the UK from Pakistan in 1946 and trained as a psychoanalyst under Anna Freud, and Donald Winnicott was one of the major figures in British psychiatry. And Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, actually said that nobody understood my father's theory as well as Masud Khan did. But there's a very interesting quote from him, and I can't see all of it myself because part of it's obscured by the Al-Mawrid logo, but let's go ahead with it. He says that since Socrates in European culture, it would be hard to find a thinker and scientist more humble, more can't see the word, and more self-convinced than Sigmund Freud. From the very beginning, as his correspondence with Wilhelm Fliess testifies, Wilhelm Fliess was his close correspondent of Freud during his early years. Freud had no doubt that he had thought that, okay, so we've got the logo removed. I'll begin again. So since Socrates in European culture, one would be hard put to find a thinker and scientist more humble, more self-questioning, and more self-convinced than Sigmund Freud. From the very beginning, as his correspondence with Wilhelm Fliess testifies, Freud had no doubt that he had, through an act of heroic and unique courage, undertaken to understand in himself and others what humans had always sought to repress, mythologize, or rationalize in terms other than the truth of the experience itself. To say what he was discovering, Freud was compelled to borrow the vocabulary of the language as it existed, but Freud had to distort and extend it to yield the meanings and insight he meant to communicate. Hence, a completely new language gradually crystallized in Freud's hermeneutics of human epistemology. Freud himself was fully and painfully aware that in time the concepts he had so diligently created to establish a new instrument of self-discovery would get taken over by the vulgar zeal of shallow familiarity. And particular emphasis on that last sentence where he talks about, you know, these ideas which he presented in his own manner have just become in common usage now. So part of this, going through the theory, would be like, this is how he actually spoke about these terms, what they meant within the context of his structure of the psyche, and so on and so forth. And also, Masud Khan points out that, you know, those terms that Freud is using were already, you know, floating around within various fields, within physics, biology, and what was, you know, emerging as a field of psychology and philosophy. But Freud wrestled them into a unified system over the course of his life, over various revisions, and now presented them as they are and how they entered the common discourse and then within the fields that he influenced after that. Raza, would it be possible perhaps to move my camera to a different part of the screen? I think the bottom left would be fine. Or make it smaller. Yeah, that's fine. So I think first we can begin by the fundamental question: what is psychoanalysis itself? So psychoanalysis was a science that Freud said that he developed, which provided an overarching theory of how the human mind works, and then eventually was adapted and adopted as a talking therapy to treat patients based on his understanding of the machinations of the mind. And now it's practiced by clinicians all over the world. It was hugely popular during his lifetime, especially during the later years. Massive during, the mid 1900s. Decline in popularity now because of other approaches and methods which came as a response to Freudian psychoanalysis, and in fact several schools developed after psychoanalysis as well. So but even now, the International Psychoanalytical Association claims around 12,000 practicing psychoanalysts. So very much still an approach that can be applied in the clinic at least. That's a very basic definition that I actually found at the Freud Museum, which I went to on Wednesday. So Freud's final home is in London, in Hampstead, where all of his belongings are now set up, and it's a museum now. So that photo, you can vaguely see in the background. I took that this Wednesday. And as soon as you walk in, this is the kind of layman's definition of what is psychoanalysis. This is the first thing you confront. So this is what was stated there. But a much more detailed definition is that it's a discipline founded by Freud, and even now the people who actually diverge from his theory, their schools are given different names. So for instance, Carl Jung's school, analytical psychology, Adler's school is a different name altogether, and the other trends and traditions that emerge after Freud have separate names to themselves. So that's fine. So when people talk about psychoanalysis, they typically do mean classical Freudian theory. So now we can understand it under three main aspects. So the first would be as a method of investigation, which consists essentially in bringing out the unconscious meaning of the words, the actions, and the products of the imagination, which are dreams, fantasies, and delusions of a particular subject, an individual. The method is founded mainly on the subject's free associations, which serve as a measuring rod of the validity of the interpretation. So free association with the subject is when the subject just says the first words that come into their mind. And psychoanalytical interpretation can, however, be extended to human productions where no free associations are available. So the psychoanalytical interpretation, while primarily done on free associations of participants, where they lay down and given a cue and they just say the first words that come into their mind, and that's analysed. Where free association isn't available, you can analyse a patient's dreams, their slips of the tongue, which are known as Freudian slips and mistakes, and even jokes. As a psychotherapeutic method based on this type of investigation and characterized by the controlled interpretation of resistance, transference, and desire. It is in a related sense that the term psychoanalysis is used to mean a course of psychoanalytic treatment, as when one speaks of undergoing psychoanalysis. So no need to worry about what resistance, transference, and desire is. We'll unpack that when we talk specifically about the theory. So number one, it's a method of investigation. Number two, it's a psychotherapeutic method that's applied. So when a person is undergoing psychoanalysis, or now he's undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy or a whole host of other treatments. And number three, as a group of psychological and psychopathological theories, which are the systematic expression of the data provided by the psychoanalytic method of investigation and treatment. So from that clinical work and from the psychoanalytic observation emerges then a group of theories. And that's primarily the theme that you'll see. So Sigmund Freud was what we now call then a psychotherapist. So he delivered this therapy, which was the talking therapy of analysing people's dreams and primarily in the free associations. And from that, he came to an understanding of what the human psyche is, what human nature is, what human development is. And then he formed, as number three says, a group of theories about the human nature and then applied it elsewhere, okay, from the data, from the investigation and treatment. And that's fundamentally the course of Sigmund Freud's life and theories, as we'll begin to see. So there's several ways we can go about this. I thought we could potentially go over the key concepts of psychoanalysis, and then perhaps look at his life. But then I realized that the life is so intertwined with his ideas that it'll be worthwhile going through a brief biography first, and then we can and mention the ideas as they emerge, and then talk about the ideas and the theories as a unified whole once we've dealt with his life. So while I've got this up right now, which is the key concepts of psychoanalysis, those 7, we will unpack those individually in the second half of the lecture, but it'd be worthwhile to keep these ideas in mind so that when they emerge, you will sort of understand, okay, we'll touch on that later. So fundamentally within psychoanalysis, there's a concept of psychological determinism, which means that no idea is without a cause. So any thought that emerges in your mind, any action, even a mistake, actually has a psychological cause within you, and that can be uncovered. And if say that the effect itself is a symptom of some mental disorder, it has a cause, a psychological cause within it, whether it's within your broader psyche, and we'll unpack what those levels are. And by then dealing with the cause, or with the cause itself, then therapy might take place. Number 2 we'll talk about is the idea of the unconscious. As I said last week, there are several schools of depth psychology, as it were, and even the people who diverged from Freud, they broadly agree on the concept of the unconscious. So whether or not other factors are involved, what's the driving force, what's the motivation of human behavior, that might differ between the schools, but what unites them fundamentally is an understanding of the idea of the unconscious. Again, we'll go through these in much more detail in the second half. Number 3, and what made Freud's ideas shocking, and what got lots of his followers to leave, most notably in Jung, was Freud's absolute emphasis that behind human behavior, the primary factor, the primary drive, is sex and sexuality and the libido. And the libido is a much broader term which encapsulates more than just sex itself, and we'll talk about that and how he actually defined libido. But a byword to Sigmund Freud and his understanding of the human nature is basically sexuality. And number 4 is, building on top of that, is the idea of drive theory. So he had this idea that it's the drive, the sex drive, the libido, eros, as he called it. That's the fundamental moving force of all human behavior and normative and abnormal human behavior, and then expressions in art and literature and even religion, as we'll see, interestingly. But while originally he posited just the sex drive fundamentally, due to certain events in his life, and because he always had a notion of there being conflicts in the human mind, he developed the idea of another drive, which was the death drive, and we'll talk about the events that precipitated that, and how the death drive and the sex drive interact later on. And based on that, he then had, and perhaps within understanding the role of sexuality, he wanted to then elaborate on how the libido and the sex drive results in the development of human personality, and how that then determines who people are later on, and what symptoms they might show later on in life. So he had an entire developmental theory which primarily revolved around the first 5 or 6 years of the child's life, in which he posited, to the shock of many, that infants from a very young age possess a sex drive, a libido, which is directed to various parts of themselves and other people, and whether or not the individual moves through those phases, or if they get stuck in those phases, or some of those phases aren't resolved, will impact them later in life, will impact their desire and what they the heterosexuality, homosexuality, and so on and so forth. Again, probably the most shocking aspect of his theory, and that's within his developmental theories where the idea of the Oedipus complex emerges, and we'll go into that. And that will be particularly important because his understanding of religion has a lot to do with the Oedipus complex. Number 6 is his structure of the psyche, what he called his meta-psychology. So he wanted to describe the basic components of the psyche, or at least what the functions of the mind are. So he originally had the idea of, he developed the idea of there being consciousness, of what's immediately aware to you in your mind, then the idea of a pre-conscious, which is memories and thoughts which you can access but aren't in the forefront of your mind at the moment. And then this idea of the unconscious, as we discussed earlier, that was his original working idea. But towards the end of his life, in the last couple of decades, he developed the idea of structured idea of there being 3 forces in conflict with each other, and the resolution of those conflicts is important in understanding whether or not a human being is normal or abnormal, and whether they show symptoms of mental disorders. And we'll touch on what those structures are, but off the top, he talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. We'll unpack those. And number 7 is he talks about specific defense mechanisms that the ego, one of those structures, applies to stop the unconscious forces from appearing into consciousness and wreaking havoc. So we'll go into some of what those defense mechanisms are. But these concepts and these theories all emanated from his experiences as a clinician, his own understanding, his own warped perceptions in some ways, and his own self-analysis. So a lot of it had to do with his process of introspection and finding certain desires, certain memories in his mind, making a connection. Okay, this might have to do with this, but then universalizing that principle not only on his patients, but making a theory saying that, okay, if I have this particular desire, then everybody has this desire. So what we'll do now, and then the second half we'll go through those key concepts properly. What we'll do is go over the man and his life. Firstly, a fascinating figure, because obviously his own life precipitated the theory. So we'll unpack aspects of his life here. So he was born in a Jewish family in 1856 in a city which is now a town which is now in Czechoslovakia. His family, so that's him on the right and his father on the left. They moved to Vienna when he was 4, and he, from a very young age, he showed signs of brilliance. So his father actually married his 3rd wife, and he's the son of the 3rd wife of Jacob Freud. So his father already had 2 sons who were as old actually as Freud's mother herself, and so within the family there were lots of kids, and then the Freud siblings, they had kids. So there's a lot going on in the family. But even within this, Freud's father wasn't particularly financially successful, so not a massive house, obviously. But even within this, Freud was given his own room, and he was obviously a brilliant student. He was top of his class for many years, and from a very young age, he was being geared towards an academic career in either law or medicine, and he wanted to turn to law. I mean, he himself, as a young child, was much more interested in art and philosophy and literature. But then he came across the writings of Goethe on nature, and that convinced him that he actually wanted to study medicine. So he entered the University of Vienna's Medical College at the age of 17, and began studying medicine. And it's during this time that I actually began reading the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach. So last week we mentioned Feuerbach had this idea of the projection theory of religion, and Freud really became invested in Feuerbach. So yeah, Feuerbach, Goethe, and Shakespeare were some of his heroes that stuck with him throughout his life. In fact, in a letter just to talk about that influence of Feuerbach, that will come later on when talking about Freud's psychology of religion. He wrote in a letter back in those student days that, you know, among all the philosophers, Feuerbach is the one that I worship and admire the most. Later on, he downplayed the influence Feuerbach had on his ideas, but that's quite clear from early on. So he begins studying medicine, but at the age of 17. But at the age of 20, he actually gets a scholarship as a research scholar in the Institute of Physiology. And so he begins to study and do research in parallel, study medicine and do research in the institute under a man called Ernst Brucker. So he's working in Brucker's lab, and he's doing his medical degree in parallel at the same time. He's doing lots of anatomical research during this period and continuing his medical studies, but graduates eventually in 1881. So once he graduates, he also gets engaged. And it's here that while he's hugely interested in continuing his research with Ernst Brucker, Brucker himself advises Freud to actually, you know, not much money in research, so he advises him to leave research altogether and get a residency at the Vienna General Hospital, so he can, you know, carve himself a career in medicine, which he does. So between when he graduates 1881 to 1884 or 5, he does 3 years at the hospital, while also doing some part-time research in Brucker's lab. And that's where one of the interesting factors takes place before the next phase, is that he begins doing a lot of research on cocaine, and especially the medical benefits of cocaine. So he uses, you know, plenty. He finds that, you know, he's working much better, and then it helps him through his depression. Not only is he doing cocaine and experimenting on it, he's actually supplying it to fellow people in Brucker's labs. So there was one other co-worker who was, you know, addicted to morphine. Freud gave him cocaine. He became hooked onto cocaine, then broke the habit and went to morphine back again. So the papers. So there was a lot of you could call that public scandal in many ways. So he eventually had to he stopped his research, ended his residency at the Vienna General Hospital, and managed to get a scholarship to go to Paris. So mind you, up to this point, he's still doing very much, you know, just physiological, neurological, material research, right? So he gets a scholarship to go to Paris to study under Jean-Martin Charcot, who himself was an established neurologist at this institute called the Saint-Patrier, which was a mental institute which could essentially house 10,000 patients at any given time. And during this time when Freud moved to Paris, several months, Charcot himself, very well-known neurologist at the time, would hold these hugely popular and very kind of like theatrical lectures, and you can vaguely see the photograph in the background, where he would treat or ostensibly treat hysterical patients with hypnosis. So he would, and hysteria, now kind of like a dated mental condition, at the time was prevalent among women with a very bizarre symptoms and affectations, and a lot of it would involve paralysis of various limbs and so on and so forth. But what Charcot was trying to show was that they'd often bring a patient, as in the photograph, he's stood next to the female patients, and you've got the demonstrators next, holding the woman. He would bring a patient, and he would hypnotize her by presenting a kind of light and then holding her head, and the patient would be in a state of hypnosis. And then through hypnotic suggestions, he would paralyze the patient's arm or another limb. And what he tried to show there was that he could induce hysterical symptoms by words. So the source and the origins of this condition were psychological, where it's verbal. And that's something Freud picked on for the first time from Charcot, and he did several demonstrations like that with various other hysterical symptoms. And also in his conversations with Charcot, Charcot introduced that germ of an idea in Freud's mind about the hysterical patients, saying that sex is always at the bottom of the trouble. So, just purely speaking about the hysterical symptoms, he said he always found that there was some kind of sexual trouble that was at the source of the problem, or the symptoms at least. So Freud used those several months with Charcot well, comes back to Vienna, and he then, in Brucker's lab, he met a man called Josef Breuer, who was several years his senior and was a physician. And he goes back to meet Breuer, and Breuer's been treating hysterical patients himself. And Breuer Breuer tried using hypnosis like Charcot did, but he wasn't particularly good at it. But Breuer found a very unique and different method of trying to treat his patients. So there's a very famous case study that Breuer carried out in 1881 on a patient called Anna O, where he talks about that particular way of approaching of curing this patient of hysteria, in which he found that he didn't need to hypnotize the patient. What would happen is that he'd find that when a patient would simply talk about or recall a memory that was associated with a particular symptom, they would then have an outpouring of emotion, which we called catharsis. And once that catharsis and that recollection of the traumatic memory associated with a symptom would happen, the symptom would be cured. So the very first instance of, and in the case of Anna O, the patient that Breuer treated, was the first instance of a talking therapy and what would be the beginning of psychoanalysis. So Freud picked this up from Josef Breuer and worked with Breuer on several other patients, and they collected their findings in a book called Studies on Hysteria, where they look at 5 cases. The first case is carried out by Breuer on Anna O, which is the first instance of bringing a memory to light, and then the symptoms of the mental disorder are cured. And then Freud deals with the 4 other patients, which they published in 1895. But remember, Freud picked up that idea that sex is at the bottom of all the trouble. That didn't sit well with Breuer. And after the publication, when Freud began emphasizing that the memories and the action and the origins and the root causes of the symptoms are fundamentally sexual in nature, then the split occurred between Breuer and Freud. So Breuer got sidelined, Freud continued this, and then developed, as it were, the psychoanalytic method. And in decades after that, Freud marginalized actually the influence that Breuer had on it and claimed that he came to all his conclusions himself. But Josef Breuer, very much the founder of the talking method and psychoanalysis. So that's the idea on memories and bringing the memory to light. What's happened next is quite interesting then. So he publishes Studies on Hysteria with Josef Breuer in 1895, and then his own father dies in 1896, and this precipitates a long period of introspection and reflection on his own thoughts and dreams for several years. And much of his theories about human development, dreams, the structure of the mind emerges from this period of his own self-analysis. So that's Freud on the left of the photograph, and on the right you've got Wilhelm Fliess, who was a close friend, and Fliess was an ear, throat and nose expert. He was a physician as well. and they had a very, very close correspondence during the period of Freud's own self-analysis, in which he talked about in depth about the dreams that he was having and what he associated that with. So he began his self-analysis essentially in 1897, and he wrote to Flea saying that, you know, that the chief patient that I'm preoccupied with at this moment is myself, and the analysis is the most difficult than any one that he's done so far. So in the process of recollecting his dreams and his childhood memories, he arrived to the conclusion that, and this is his quote, saying in a letter written to Fleece, again, those letters are an invaluable record about how his thoughts developed in those early years, because he destroyed much of his papers afterwards, and he knew that the impact that he would have. Actually, he wrote a letter to his wife that he's destroying much of the work that he's written up to that point to make it difficult for his biographers. So he hadn't made it then, but he knew the impact that some of his thoughts have and impacts in his vanity. He said that, you know, his biographers would have trouble looking for the origins of his ideas. So that's why the letters to William Fleece are hugely important. But he writes in the letter that I found in my case too the phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood. If this is so, we can understand the gripping power of Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Rex is a play by Sophocles. We'll talk about that later on. But within his self-analysis, he came to the conclusion that he was sexually attracted to his mother and felt a deep hostility and rivalry and jealousy towards his father. And that then becomes the central part of his theory, the Oedipus complex. And then how that develops in early childhood is then how he frames it later on. But he had several memories that he attributed to that. When he was a very young child, him and his mother were traveling from Vienna to Freiburg, and on the train journey he saw his mother naked, and then he attributes a lot of sexual attraction that he felt even as a young child towards his mother and various other instances. And then he recounts certain memories of hostility towards his father. So he was obviously very jealous then that he couldn't possess his mother. You know, he had this father figure. But it was very weird because his stepbrothers were essentially the same age as his mother. He often thought that his stepbrothers were actually more suited for it. Very odd ideas about the interplay of the family and how his own nephews and the stepchildren's kids were his own siblings, and he felt hostility towards them. And with his own father, he had a very kind of like mixed kind of relationship. While he greatly respected him, he also recounts that his father told him that, you know, once he was walking along the road and on the pavement, and a passerby knocked his hat off his father's head and said, "Get off the road, you Jew." And then Freud asked him, "What did he do?" So he was hoping that, you know, his father fought back or resisted, and turns out his father just said, "No, I just went off the pavement, picked up my hat, and carried on walking." So he had a deep kind of like, you know, resentment in terms of that as well. What I'd say is it is then in this period that he realized or begins to study the importance of looking at dreams and dream analysis to understand unconscious desires, because he then, what as he labeled was that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. So this concept of the unconscious, which he believed then was which he developed during this period, was where primarily most human, or at least the more important human thought process and conflicts take place. The area of the mind that is inaccessible, the area of the mind where thoughts have been repressed. So the unconscious isn't just this abstract, like in a waste bin where ideas go. There are forces at work within the unconscious which emerge within dreams and other places. And that's why I said that dreams are a royal road to understanding the unconscious, because they're the unconscious wishes that people have and the desires that they have present themselves, albeit in a slightly different form. So he presented a theory of dreams where, you know, dreams have a manifest content, so whatever appears in the dream, but there's a latent content which, through the process of analysis and understanding the various ways in which symbols within dreams are changed, our symbols or fantasies that we have are changed and presented within a dream. So obviously a lot of that is sexual. So if he sees some dreams about a tower, then that's obviously got to do with the male genitalia. If he sees a cave or something else, that's got to do with the female genitalia. It's a very sexualized view of the dreams and the way it's symbolized, because of Freud's view that, primarily all drives and desires within human beings are of a sexual nature. And because of their repression, then within dreams, they appear within as various symbols. So that's one way in which repressed or unconscious desires are presented within dreams. There's also the idea of condensation, where several various themes are then meshed into a symbol, and then it's the work of the analyst or the person introspecting to then unpack what the various threads or thoughts that feed into that condensed symbol or idea or event that occurs in a dream. There's also an idea of displacement, where people might be having a dream and might be focusing on one thing, but it's actually the peripheral thing that's actually more important. So dream from that perspective as well, and the events around that, to understand what's really happening. So he wrote this book called The Interpretation of Dreams, based a lot on his own dreams during that period in 1900, where he talked about those various aspects of the dream, about the latent and manifest content, but also developed primarily his fundamental theory about the levels of consciousness in the human mind. There he presents his first metapsychology, as he called it at that time, that human beings, the consciousness is divided into those three levels: consciousness, pre-conscious, and then unconscious, and then develops his entire idea of the role of unconscious in the human mind. And then he keeps building on that, and within those years, then he develops the idea that it's not only just dreams that are the role to the unconscious, but also slips of the tongue, words come out that you didn't intend to say that actually might reveal what you originally meant. So there's like a common joke, slip of the tongue, or a Freudian slip that's known now, is when you need to say one thing but you mean your mother. So again, a lot of it has to do with sexual innuendo and slips of the tongue that might emerge as such. Actions, people that they keep making the same mistakes. So you develop the idea of a repetition compulsion, for instance, like a person who keeps having the same accident, or they end up, say, dating someone of the very same kind of abusive personality, that kind of repetition. And that, for Freud and other mistakes like that keep happening on a repetitive basis, reveal for him an unconscious proclivity or desire towards something. It's very specific. And yes, he developed, so he published a book on the dreams, then he had another book called Psychology of Everyday Life, which talked about things like Freud concepts and so on and so forth. And he developed his theory on the idea of jokes, as well, the jokes and their relation to the unconscious within those early few years. He had a falling out with William Felice, so they actually at public congress they even had a huge argument towards the end of their letters. They're much more at conflict. So Felice then ultimately says that he suggested that Freud was basically projecting his own thoughts into his patients, which basically was. So like the idea of the Oedipus complex, he said, okay, Freud is saying that because I have a sexual desire towards my mother, ipso facto, not only to my patients but everyone else does as well, and I'm going to judge entire mankind and humanity about how they resolve that conflict of desiring their mother within society, the oppression of the father, and so on and so forth. So Felice wasn't wrong. So from 1890 to 1900, after his experience of working with Charcot, and then with Breuer, and that self-analysis, he develops his idea of the unconscious, where he realizes the primacy of the sex drive within it. The next period, 1902 to 1910, is he really works out his theory of how the sex drive and the libido functions in the human mind, and how that leads to human development. So we'll go through a bit of that now. So Freud now is living the good life. He's got a big family now, got 6 kids, and living the high life, is working very hard. I mean, I don't think he's in cocaine at this point. I think he stopped taking cocaine around the 1900s. A lot of that self-analysis work was done doing cocaine highs, but he's working from 8 o'clock in the morning all the way up to 11, 1 even 1 a.m. in the night, and then delivering lectures on the weekend, smoking 20 cigars a day, and collecting these antique statues, which are on display now as well at the Freud Museum. Still delivering lectures on Saturday evenings at the university, without any preparation, without any notes. And he's beginning to assemble a little group on Wednesdays where they get to talk about these ideas and develop the theory that emerges. Weekly meetings, and then this will eventually develop and germinate into the International Psychoanalytical Association. So he develops the ideas in a work called The 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. And this is where he presents the idea of the stages of the psychosexual development, which we'll talk about when we get to the theory, and develops the idea of the Oedipal complex more thoroughly in subsequent revisions of the papers that happened during this year, during this time frame. He also, some of his more famous case studies are done during this period, in which he finds credence for his ideas about the role of the sex drive and mental illness and normative behavior as well. So cases like Dora, Ratman, Little Hans, if you're interested in looking at specific case studies, they're all published. And again, a lot of it has to do with believing Freud at his own word. Was he looking into his patients, or was he fabricating aspects of the analysis? A lot of debate around that. But also during this period, one of his he started through the Wednesday groups, but also started getting more people attracted to the movement itself. And among those was in 1907, I believe, Carl Jung, on the right of the photograph. He'd already been presenting Freud's dream analysis work as early as 1901 in Zurich, where he was based. In 1907, he came to meet Freud, huge fan, wrote to him, came to meet him. They sat down, started talking, and by the time they were talking, they realized 13 hours had passed. And that then began a very intense kind of, professional relationship of Freud really regarding Jung as his heir apparent and his prince, as he'd often call him. There's a huge correspondence between them as well, and the ideas, how Jung's own personal ideas then interact with Freud to make Freud look in certain angles as well, but also Jung's primary resistance to Freud's emerging idea was that Freud was seeing sex in absolutely everything. And when it comes to theory, when we talk about this theory of psychosexual development and the Oedipus complex, you see where some of those issues might or conflicts might come. But yeah, this period from 1902 to 1910 was primarily in consolidating his understanding of infantile sexuality. So that experience of him saying that, I felt love for my mother and hate for my father, he developed that into an entire theory of development, which occurs within the first 6 years of a child's life. And then we'll unpack that later. So that photograph I showed last time as well, this was a time when Freud and Jung and other people of the Psychoanalytical Association were invited by G. Stanley Hall to a conference at Clark University. I think it was their 20th anniversary there. Originally, Freud rejected the proposal, but then Clark offered him and Jung not only a speaking spot, but gave them honorary doctorates as well from the university. So Freud and Jung traveled together. And I think it was around this period that Freud he was having an argument with Jung over dinner, and then he collapsed. And when he recovered, he accused that he accused of Jung of having a death wish against him. That's what caused the collapse. But also there were obviously all these other theoretical differences that were emerging, which was beginning to cause a split between the two men. And then Jung eventually had to well, Jung's relationship with Freud began to break down around 1913, but he was still, so Mr. Point there was that from the Wednesday meetings and the associations, because Freud, while he was based in Vienna, and Jung was originally in Zurich, so Freud managed to find a center for psychoanalysis in Zurich through Jung, but other centers around the world also emerged in London, in New York, in Budapest. And so now with centers and constellations of analysts around the world, they sought to make an international psychological association in 1910, and Jung was nominated and eventually elected as the president of that. And partly the motivation was that most of the other analysts were Jewish, and they wanted to nominate to show this as a non-Jew and a very successful, analyst out of Zurich, and placed him as the president. And he, through the conflicts as well that emerged between him and Freud, stayed on as the president until 1914, when he resigned from that altogether, and then went off and developed his own school of theory called analytical psychology, which we'll go through in a few weeks, and see how he developed Freud's ideas, not just on unconscious, developing into something called the collective unconscious, but also really not giving too much credence to Freud's emphasis on the libido and the sex drive being the primary driver of human behavior. I think then, in that period, of course, then in this era, Jung leaves the IPA, the International Psychological Association. It becomes much more dogmatic. So anyone who disagrees with Freud's emphasis on the libido then is either kicked out. So it's kind of like developing a kind of like a very rigid dogmatic understanding of theory, and Freud at the center, and then psychoanalysts developing and refuting anyone who diverges too much from him. So once more, there is a consolidation of the movement in the various cities around the world. Here, Freud then begins to start applying his theory beyond just clinic. So by 1910, he's doing an analysis of Leonardo da Vinci's work and biography, and then he's applying his theory to literature. So literature and art as well. So he's through his analysis of da Vinci's work, he managed to come to the conclusion by applying his theories and ideas that da Vinci was a homosexual, and he also was an illegitimate child. So early germinations of ideas of the application of it in the broader sphere. But also in 1913, precipitated by a disagreement that he had with Jung, but also his own reading of the great anthropological work, The Golden Bough by James Fraser, 10-volume massive work. I saw that at the library, and I went on and see it as well. He begins to write his first work about the origins of religion, called Totem and Taboo, which he published in 1913. That will be one of the works that we'll be discussing in a couple of weeks when it comes to his theory. So perhaps not too much on that now, but know that it has a lot to do with the Oedipal complex. So we'll talk about the theory in a moment. Also in that period, World War I happens. His sons are called up to serve in the army, and because the destruction of culture, civilization, and obviously the physical destruction of the war, he develops the idea of the death drive. So he always wanted to have, well, he always had the concept of there being conflicts within the mind. So he for the longest time had this idea of the libido and the sex drive, so the eros, and then he counterpointed that with the death drive, the desire to destroy and turn things back into the inorganic state, and the desire for aggression, and he put them in conflict and developed that theory. And then he also, at that point, he was working with the idea of the topographical model, as it's called, of consciousness, and then you've got pre-consciousness. Again, we've discussed that, and the unconscious, where these drives are pushing for expression into consciousness. He revised that model and developed the idea of the id, ego, and the superego. Again, we'll go into that when we talk about theories. So much later into his career, he's revised much of his model for the human psyche. So, but by the end of this period, much, and if not all, the theory that he developed is consolidated. So what he does from this period onwards is then what he called his own heresies, was that in that final 15 to 16 years of his life, he then applies those theories much more broadly, as he was beginning to do earlier, to understand society, politics, and particularly religion. And those are some of the texts that we're going to be properly studying in 2 weeks' time. So, much of the theory, historically speaking, as we've discussed, all done up to this point, and we'll unpack that theory in the second part of the session. And then the heresies themselves will be unpacked in 2 weeks' time in those texts that he primarily wrote in that period. So just in terms of biographical detail as well, it was early on during that period in 1923 that he actually had to get treatment for cancer in his jaw. He used to smoke, as I said, 20 cigars a day, serious cancer there. And although the signs of that began emerging in 1917, he had that first major treatment in 1923, and he had like 30 surgical procedures done after that. And in 1923, he was given only like 5 years to live, but he managed to survive another 16. Major historical development during that point was that the Nazis came into power in Germany in 1933, and they ordered the burning of all of Freud's books there. Again, Freud is based in Vienna. And then Hitler invades Vienna in 1938, and Freud has to leave Vienna and manages to escape from Vienna to London in 1938 with his daughter Anna Freud. The Nazis released all of Freud's belongings, and so they managed to bring all this to London in Hampstead, in a house where he lived for the final year of his life. That house now is the museum, which again houses all of his belongings, and where Anna Freud lived until 1980, until her death, and they made a museum out of it. Freud's 4 sisters, who were based in Austria, did not manage to leave, and all of them were killed in concentration camps. But then Freud lived in London and then wrote his final work on religion called Modernity and Monotheism, which was published posthumously, but completed in that final year of his life. And by that time, the cancer in his jaw had gotten so bad and it was so poorly that he essentially requested assisted suicide, given a fatal dose of morphine to kill him off. So he died in 1939, and it was in that final period that he wrote some of his most influential works of the application of his theory to society. And those works, which he called his 3 heresies, he wrote The Future of an Illusion, again, the idea of the illusion coming back from Feuerbach, but applying his theory that he developed to religion. And then he wrote another one on civilization in general, civilization as discontents. And that final work that he wrote towards the end of his life, Moses and Monotheism, where he challenged the entire story of monotheism through. We'll talk about that next week. So know that in 2 weeks. Sorry. So our next session will be about those heresies and that one earlier work, Totem and Taboo, that he wrote in 1913. So that's a brief overview of his life. Next step would be to then talk about those key concepts in a little more depth. It's a bit of a tour de force